This is a review of the menstrual cycle, which of course is necessary in order for an egg to be released and for an egg to be fertilized. So I'm going to go through the steps, I'm going to go through the hormones, and something that I want you to also be thinking about, maybe adding to your Cornell notes, is thinking about when is it a good example of negative feedback and when is it a good example of positive feedback. So the entire cycle actually begins with the first day of a woman's period, and it actually is a perfect example of negative feedback. Estrogen levels get really low, and it signals the brain. In your brain, you have hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which are literally, if you could go to the center of your brain here, underneath the cerebrum. The hypothalamus notices the low level of estrogen. So when a level is low and it wants to increase that level back up, that is negative feedback. So the way that it does it is it sends a hormone called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And it's going to send that hormone through the blood to the pituitary gland. So it's a very short distance traveled here. In the pituitary gland, there are other hormones that are made. FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, LH. The first is the follicle stimulating hormone, so the gonadotropin releasing hormone triggered the pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone. The way that hormones travel is through the blood, so this follicle stimulating hormone leaves the pituitary gland, travels through the blood, and there has to be a target cell. It's always about the receptors and what can be picked up in what organ. So even though that hormone is traveling through your entire body, receptors for follicle stimulating hormone are only located in ovaries and testes. So here in the women's ovaries, the hormone is picked up by the target cell and it causes an action to happen. And what happens is the follicle, so inside of a woman's ovary are all the eggs that she will ever have. And each of those eggs are surrounded by a follicle, and we call the egg an ovum. Each follicle, one per month, could expand and grow and mature. And as it does that, it begins more to look like this picture. So here, this would be the ovum here in the center, and this entire area we call the follicle. So inside of the ovary, there could be 200 follicles within, and each month, one ovary from one side will develop one follicle. And the idea is we want this ovum to be released because fertilization happens in the oviduct. So the hormone FSH, which again came from the pituitary gland, travels through the blood, signals the ovary starts developing a follicle, and it gets larger. Two things happen. It gets larger. It also starts making the hormone estrogen. So estrogen is made in the ovary, in the follicle. At the same time, LH, another hormone, is also increased in production from the pituitary gland. So FSH comes first, starts the follicle developing. Estrogen levels are still really low because they're first just being made by the follicle. And as estrogen levels get higher, it signals the pituitary gland to make luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone will then peak. And when you see the graph peak, it is almost always right around day 14. This represents ovulation. So when luteinizing hormone is at its highest, the follicle releases the egg. So here's a picture. Here's the edge of the ovary. Here's the follicle bursting, and there, this tiny little thing right here, that is the ovum being released from the follicle. Next, you can see the ovum starting to enter the oviduct, or the fallopian tube. It has about 5 to 6 days that it will be able to survive. And usually fertilization happens in the top part of the oviduct. So if there is fertilization, it's probably going to occur in this first region here. When the ovulation occurs, the remaining follicle, which has now lost its ovum, it becomes what's called a corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is a yellow, puffy body inside of the ovary, and it produces another hormone, progesterone. Progesterone will help build up the lining of the uterus. So we got to talk about the uterus for a little bit. The uterus is that large organ where if an embryo is formed, where it will develop. In the beginning of the cycle, the lining is shed, so there's no tissue there ready for an embryo to implant. In the beginning of the cycle, as the follicle starts producing estrogen, the level of the uterine lining grows. So it thickens with blood. And as it gets thicker, we reach, here's day 14, ovulation. So when the egg is released, there already is quite a bit of lining. But if you think about it, that embryo is going to need to embed itself in a nutrient-rich, bloody area of the uterus. So progesterone is made by the corpus luteum, and it makes the endometrium even thicker. So here, this is a good time for getting pregnant, because right here is when the egg has been released and the uterine lining is thick and ready for that zygote and that embryo to embed itself into it. What happens if there is no fertilization? The corpus luteum starts to disintegrate and it does not make estrogen or progesterone anymore. So when it's active, the endometrium is thick, and when it starts to disintegrate, then that causes menstruation to occur. If there is fertilization, the embryo will embed itself into the endometrium and it will release a hormone called HCG. That stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. That hormone will signal the corpus luteum to stay and to keep making more progesterone and more progesterone. So that's a nice example of positive feedback. The presence of this one hormone increasing the production of another hormone. So the progesterone keeps the lining, and after about 3 months, the embryo's placenta will be able to produce its own progesterone, and only at that point will the corpus luteum actually start to decay. Those are all the steps. So what I would like you to do now is to go back through and figure out, when is it negative feedback? When do I have this nice normal level of hormone and I am either at a low, so I used the example at the beginning, when estrogen levels are low, then it signaled the hypothalamus to release gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is going to end up developing follicle stimulating hormone in the pituitary gland, and then eventually leading to the follicle to make estrogen, and then estrogen levels will be able to go back up. So that's a nice example of negative feedback, and I want you to go through and figure out at which points are they negative feedback and at which points are they positive feedback.